perfectly well for me. But I think these, in a sense, to me, are panic reactions. There's a little bit of fear in the government. These are distraction tactics. We, of course, came out with the name India for our coalition, and it's a fantastic idea because it represents exactly who we are. We consider ourselves to be the voice of India, and so the word works very well. But it's obviously disturbed the Prime Minister enough that he wants to change the name of the country, which is absurd, but that's what it is. It's also interesting that every time we raise the issue of Mr. Adani and crony capitalism, the Prime Minister comes out with some dramatic new diversion tactic. You know, it's curious that just after I did a press conference on Adani, this entire diversion is put into place. It's interesting.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
EU journalist for Radio Novo Time. Again, thank you. In view of the COP28, the climate conference in Dubai, what are your expectations? And do you think that India is going to be the major spokesperson for the Global South? Thank you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think India has a relationship with the Global South, and I think there are bonds there, historical bonds there, that make us close to the Global South. I don't know if we are the spokesman of the Global South, but certainly we have a relationship with them. On the environment, of course, we are, as a planet, going through these large transitions, energy transition in the way we move. And I think environment is a central issue for India. It's of course not in a country where there are many poor people. It's difficult to make environment top of mind, but I think it is a critical issue, and it's very important that we think about it in a strategic and a long-term way.
Thanks. Brian Ricketts, representing the European coal industry, and I've enjoyed visits to European coal industry, and I've enjoyed visits to coal power plants and mines in India. And my hope for the future is a democratic India. And the question relates to that. As China developed very rapidly over the last few decades, its economy became imbalanced, and it's now paying the price for that, I believe. How would you ensure that India's economy doesn't become imbalanced? So how to balance the powers of a market-based economy versus central planning?
I think one of the lessons that I learned in my walk was that there is an inherent and profound wisdom in the people of my country, right? Regardless of which part of society they're in. For example, we're discussing environment. The type of conversations I had with tribal people about the environment were far more sophisticated than I have with people living in cities, right? So there is an inherent wisdom in the people of India, and I'm sure in the people of Europe and people of Belgium. And I think it's critical for us that in decision making, we listen to the voice and the intelligence of the people. And that's where we have a fundamental difference with the BJP. We value the voice of the people, we value the voice of poor people, we value the voice of all stakeholders, and we want to hold a conversation with stakeholders before we make decisions. It's sometimes slower, but in the long run, it works out much better. And that's really the conflict that is taking place in India. They're of the view that you don't need to ask people, you just go ahead and, slam everything through. But in our view, there's consequences. With regards to the public sector and the private sector, we are pretty clear that in key strategic areas, public sector should have a role. In education, in healthcare, public sector should provide a foundation. But in other spaces, private industry is probably a better tool to achieve most aims.
Just one or two more. Quick.
Very quick one.
But you asked you asked 4 questions. You've asked 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, please. Thank you. Anybody else?
Nobody else, go ahead.
Then one or two. That's it.
I think the agenda that you're talking about, mostly what has been happening in the election manifestos, usually, the manifestos of the parties, that's how the elections were initially fought or held, where parties came and spoke about the manifestos. Now, with all the changes that have happened in India, we know so many PSUs have been privatized or are on the verge of being privatized in India. How, in case in next year's elections, in case tables turn and we see the opposition and the alliance probably coming forward and running the country, how do you think those kind of changes that were, that is so massive that have been happening can be reverted
which
or
changes?
corrected? The privatization of public sector units, that has been happening in India. How do you actually rectify that? Because that has actually taken away employment of so many housewives. I mean, women like my mother would probably be a very good candidate for an SBI, banking job, but a private sector will not necessarily employ a person of her age and will look for a more competitive, growth. So I think that's where I see a lot of people will lose employment because of this in India and are doing that. How does this get rectified?
Where we draw the line is the notion of crony capitalism, right? We don't have a problem with the private sector. We don't have a problem with the government sector. Where we draw the line is where 1 or 2 people start to financially control the whole country, right? And where 1 or 2 people or 3 people are running everything. That's where our problem begins. There's another element to this, which is that government policies in India have systematically attacked the backbone of our employment system. If you look at who gives employment in India, it's the small and medium industry that gives employment in India. And demonetization and GST have devastated those structures, right? So it's a 2-pronged attack that the government is carrying out. Number one, impose a huge transaction cost on all small and medium businesses and ensure that you build 2 or 3 monopolists who control pretty much everything, right? So if you look at Mr. Adani, our problem with Mr. Adani is he controls the ports, he controls the airports, he controls agriculture, he controls grain silos, he has real estate. I mean, he's everywhere. And he's dominant everywhere. He controls cement, right? So we think that's counterproductive for the country. And on one side, they are pushing this very monopolistic capital. And on the other side, they're devastating the small and medium people from where we're going to get a job. That's why we're having an unemployment crisis. And the second part is where you require key services, right? Country like India requires the government to be involved in education. It requires the government to be involved in healthcare. And the idea that you can just privatize education and privatize healthcare, it devastates the poorest people because they simply do not have access to this. So they are hitting this from 3 or 4 sides, and the solutions are pretty clear. I mean, we would invest much more in health and education. We would protect small and medium businesses. We would try to build an economy where small and medium businesses transition to medium businesses and then to large businesses and then to massive businesses, right? If you look at if you look at our small and medium businesses, almost none of them become big businesses, right? They remain small or they die, right? And it's because of policy. So you can change policies to ensure that you start building champions in these smaller and medium spaces, and you can certainly invest much more in education and healthcare. I'm not saying there's no role for private businesses in education. There is, but the mainstay of any education system in a country like India has to be, it's a government responsibility, and the government can't just say, okay, we are going to, abrogate from this responsibility. So the things that can be done and need to be done are pretty clear. They're not complicated. And if you look at our last manifesto, I think we ironed out quite a few of these ideas. One of the other ideas that we have, which we've tested now, you can get a sense of how we think about these things by looking at our states. So if you look at the healthcare system in Rajasthan, that'll give you a good sense of what we are thinking in terms of healthcare for the country. If you look at our social programs in Karnataka, you get a sense of how we are thinking about social programs for the country. So we tend to run a pilot somewhere, see if it works, and then scale it up. And, for example, Manrega was such a case where we ran a small pilot, then we scaled it into a state, and then we scaled it into the nation. We don't believe in, these rash decisions where you suddenly demonetize the economy or you suddenly impose a GST. We believe in seeding an idea, letting that idea grow, testing the idea, and then scaling it across. Chhattisgarh has some very good ideas on how to support farmers with minimum prices. Karnataka has our, the sort of support that we're giving to women in Karnataka. That's some very interesting work that's going on. And in each one of our states, you can see the sort of type of ideas that we will use when we come to power.
Last question.
When you were talking to the parliamentarians, you said it was a conversation and you were informing them about sharing, your reading of what's happening in India. And you have repeated here that, there are problems back home when it comes to institutions and democratic structures. What was their response to you? Did they seem concerned? Did they seem...
Yeah, they were very concerned. They were very concerned, and they felt that they felt that there is an attempt to stifle the democratic structures of India, for sure. And I mean, they were very, very clear with us.
Okay.
Have more questions?
You have more questions?
Yeah.
No, I
I
think 5 questions for one person is good enough. I mean, if you,
Okay.
Responses are coming to everybody.
Thank you. No, but thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate. Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you very much.
And we hope to see you again. Be in touch. Thank you.